Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which you can of course grab in its audio-only form via the SoundCloud link down below, but for now, this YouTube version is definitely more beneficial for the channel, and this topic was kind of a suggested one, but also a revisiting, interestingly, of a very early episode of this series. I think it might have been around the 20th or 30th episode, where I discussed self-driving cars. Or I guess you can more accurately say autonomous cars, I suppose. But I do find it to be an interesting discussion, and although I haven't revisited that episode to see where my thoughts were and to compare them to if they've changed now, it would be interesting to potentially do so after this episode. Now, I believe there are basically three primary stances that you can take on autonomous cars, and they are that you can be 100% against it, where you don't want them on the road, you don't want anything to do with them. There's the other end of the spectrum, where you're all for it, you love future technology, you wouldn't miss rush hour traffic when you can just sit back, have a coffee, read the paper, and let the car do it for you. I can certainly appreciate the merits of that, especially if you have a long commute or live in a busy city, or maybe you're a little bit older and you're kind of over the joy of driving at this point perhaps. But I do believe there's a middle ground as well, and the middle ground is kind of where I believe I am. And the reason why I say a middle ground is because for me there are two distinct things that I feel differently on. One is sharing the road with autonomous cars. The other is being in one. And to me, those are two very different decisions to make, because most people think about autonomous cars more so from just the point of view of being in one. Most people don't seem to think so much about sharing the road with one. Now that, I think, is dependent on the very interesting discussion, which could be an entire episode in its own right, of how this technology, if it ever rolls out, how will it roll out? For instance, would autonomous cars share the roads? Or would it be a blanket thing where they completely replace all cars? Now, I would think of the two, it's probably the former, because it would be a very difficult thing to get all cars off the road and then, without losing anyone's time and money, replacing all of them at the same time with autonomous. That would be virtually impossible, in fact. You would need to have a borderline militarized system to enable something like that to happen. So I think that's a fairly simple question. But that does raise the issue of driving on the road with vehicles that have no driver around you. Maybe driving behind an autonomous bus, or sharing the highway with an autonomous truck, or maybe even just having autonomous taxis in a particular city. And of course there are currently in multiple places throughout the world, but especially as far as I understand in San Francisco, or at least it was a couple of years ago, there are autonomous cars being tested on the road. Cars that have no passenger, no driver whatsoever in the vehicle. Google, I think, was testing a car, a couple of other companies as well. And that's interesting. It shows that it can be done at least. But the interesting thing for most people is, and this is curious because it doesn't tend to apply to certain specific other things, even though they have similarities, and I'll get into why. But most people seem to distrust the technology more when it comes to that than anything else with regard to a car. And I find that very curious. And of course, much like how last week was to do with the way humans think, this episode also touches on that as well. Because last week it touched on, the way we distance ourselves from things that aren't perfect, but at the same time we support them and view it as an underdog, etc. This time it's more about the innate human distrust for a loss of control, because we love to be in control. For instance, if you're a passenger in a car with somebody who clearly is not a good driver, you'll probably be a little bit antsy about it. Maybe if you're driving a car that you're not comfortable with, you'll be a little bit nervous because you don't fully feel in control. Why do learner drivers drive like they do? Because they're not in control yet. They're learning to be. And that, I think, is the most interesting question. More of a moral question, really, than a science one regarding self-driving or autonomous cars. Most people don't want to give up that kind of responsibility to a machine. And why is that? Well, because no matter how good the machine is, it was still made by humans. And humans make faulty machines. So it is going to break. It doesn't matter who made it. It could be Kia, could be Rolls-Royce, could be Bentley, could be Zenvo. Doesn't matter who makes the technology, it will break. Every car that has ever been built has broken, and every car that will ever be built has broken down. So speaking purely personally, I think that there's a big differentiation between me sharing the road with one and me being in one. For me, I actually have no issue whatsoever with driving my car on the road with autonomous vehicles. In fact, I think under certain circumstances, it would actually be easier to drive with autonomous vehicles around you. Because, for instance, a huge amount of time is lost at every set of traffic lights. Because if you look at the way humans pull away, we don't all pull away at the same time. We pull away in a wave, and then we stop in a wave at the next red light. That's not efficient. It's very slow. A machine, or a line of machines, would all pull away at the same time, because they would be in sync. So you'd save a huge amount of time, especially over the course of months and years. So for me, no, I would not have an issue with that. If the machines are programmed correctly, I see no problem with driving behind an autonomous bus, which is set to stop at certain places at certain times. It would probably be more reliable than the existing service. Maybe autonomous trash trucks, autonomous taxis, that kind of stuff. I think the interesting change for me personally, though, comes when the choice becomes, do I want to be in one? Because the answer to that is no. And the reason why it's no is for multiple reasons, actually. Because, one, I myself do not trust the technology, and it's not a case of, these modern robots, they're going to take our jobs. It's nothing to do with that. It's the simple fact of what I explained earlier. It will break. And what if it breaks with you in it? That's a very real, legitimate concern to have. There's a reason why things are serviced, and it's because they degrade over time, including the human body. So I have that issue. Secondarily to that, I like driving, and I don't like the idea of just sitting in a box, because, let's be honest, that's what most of them will probably look like. Just flying down the road, reading or something. That just doesn't interest me in the slightest. To me, driving is not just a case of transportation, because if people just wanted transportation, there are so many other options. Buses, trains, taxis, Ubers. There are so many ways to get around, and even though a car is the most personally convenient, it's not always the cheapest, especially once you factor in buying it, taxing it, insuring it, repairing it, keeping it serviced, and putting fuel in the thing. So it's not necessarily the most cost-effective, it's just the most convenient. I don't want to give that up for the sake of just getting somewhere a few seconds or a few minutes earlier and not having to steer and press the pedal myself. I just don't like that idea. So that, combined with the fact that it will break at some point and people will die in them, it's gonna happen, then yeah, I would rather, I guess, be in control of my own vehicle if I was gonna die than be in the hands of a machine. Now, of course, the discussion that always comes up, and it doesn't come up as much now, which kind of is ironic to me, considering that we are closer to autonomous cars than we were, every year prior, is the choice, that AI choice that the car will have to make, that Clarkson even raised on Top Gear, and that is, what if the car has to make a decision between you and a pedestrian? Will it kill you, or will it kill them? I love the fact, and I know some people find it very controversial, but I absolutely love the fact that Mercedes came out recently and specifically said that their autonomous cars favour the passengers, not pedestrians and not people in other cars. And I think that is a brilliant idea. And the reason why I think it's a brilliant idea actually has nothing to do with the safety of the pedestrians or that kind of argument. I'm not talking about that at all. I think it's a great idea because there is currently no legislation about that. And although once autonomous cars, or if autonomous cars became the norm, you can bet your ass that legislation would come out. Of course it would. But for now, a company can make their autonomous car make whatever decision they want. Of course, within reason. You could program the car to favour the pedestrian. You could program it to favour the driver. And let's be honest, it's a difficult argument to argue which one is morally better. And I find that interesting because from a marketing point of view, it would be a question and a choice which no car purchaser in history has ever had to make before. Do I want to buy the Mercedes, which will protect me, or do I want to buy, let's say, the Audi the Audi would protect the driver. The Audi one will probably drive as close as possible to the car in front. So let's say the Volkswagen version will favour the pedestrians. You'd have to choose where your priority is. And although, let's be honest, most of us would choose self-preservation, of course. It's part of the reason why we don't trust the autonomous cars in the first place. I do find it interesting that different companies could potentially offer different options. Or maybe even within the car, you could make the moral choice of going into settings, but this time, instead of setting how high you want the brightness on your phone to be or what Wi-Fi you want to connect to, it's whether or not you want to kill a pedestrian or yourself. And that is more of a real possibility than it might sound. But I'll be completely honest that when it comes to this issue, my personal motivations are, without any question, and I freely admit, very selfish. My primary reason why I don't want an autonomous car has nothing to do with morals, safety, or costs. It's purely because I like driving. And I think that, along with many other people who do as well, will probably mean that a full automated takeover would be almost impossible. And if possible, certainly very far off. I believe that the ultimate destiny for the automotive, self-driving machine, if you will, would be to be integrated into society, not to become society. Or in other words, society's main transportation is what I'm referring to. However, I do believe that the first rollout of automated tests and maybe even actual commercialized use would almost certainly be a combination of commercial and military. Military vehicles that are automated, you've already got drones, for instance. You could then have stuff like, as I said, buses, taxis, trash trucks, those kind of machines that you don't necessarily need a driver for, because, let's be honest, the vast majority of driving that requires a person to physically make choices behind the wheel tends to be the more personal stuff. Whereas something like a bus, well, it's traveling the same route over and over again. So, as far as programming a machine goes, I would imagine that would be fairly simple to do. For instance, if you think about how complex it would be to program a bus to run the same 5-mile loop and pick people up at every stop at every time, well, surely that would be much simpler to do safely than it would be to program your car to completely make an automated journey from your house to Scotland, or from your house, through the Channel Tunnel into Europe. Well, there are so many more variables. The car is probably driving on roads it's never been on before. Chances are it's never, been programmed for that specifically. And the car would be, in effect, making thousands of choices every second. Whereas a bus that's just doing the same route every day, it's simple in comparison. All it has to do is navigate the changing environment and potential risks of other cars on the road, if somebody was to step out, for instance. All that kind of stuff is much, much more simple than having like an automated sat-nav system. But I do find it interesting to see, or at least to imagine, what could ultimately happen if all cars, which as I said I don't think will happen, but imagine if everything on the street became fully automated, which I believe is essentially the case in iRobot, the movie, and maybe Minority Report as well. I don't recall if all of the vehicles are automated. I think some of them are drivable, but that's the essential idea of a lot of these future sci-fi based movies. I believe that what would happen when, if that were to happen, if everything on the street was automated, I believe that driving would become almost like a cinema or a comic book shop. It would become this niched thing that becomes highly collectible, and you'd probably only be able to drive on like a racetrack, and you'd be able to drive, like electric race cars or hydrogen race cars or something like that, and that would probably be, in effect, like the grown-up version of a theme park, where you'd go there to drive and experience this old way of doing things. And to me, that sounds kind of sad, because of course I would miss driving, and as I said, I don't think it would get to that point, but I do find it interesting to have as a discussion. There are lots of things to discuss, and as I said way at the start of the discussion, I would touch on the fact of how this is different to the choices that people already make, despite the fact that it's more similar than they might think. And that is that people don't like the idea of giving up the responsibility of driving to the car, and yet at the same time they give no second thought to having a car which has all of these existing electronic connections and computer-based decisions being made when it comes to traction control, ABS, airbags, all that kind of stuff that relies on these minute electronic connections. And if any one of them goes wrong, it'll easily kill you. It's funny because all cars are like that now, and yet we don't generally give it a second thought. And at the end of the day, the reason why we don't is a fallacy. We simply believe that we are in control, and as such, we're not as worried, even though the reality is, you're barely in control. You're not really in control of a car at all. You're just a pilot, and although that is technically being in control, there are so many things that could go wrong, and if any one of them did, you'd be out of control very quickly. But overall, I do certainly believe that it's an interesting and valid discussion to be had, so of course I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.